Well, hello and welcome back to That Girl's Quilting Threads and Things. And if this is your first time, welcome. Today's quilt block is inspired, and I want to say thank you very much to one of my viewers who made a special request. For GGM, today's quilt block is a walkabout, or it's also called a spice rack. If you're interested in seeing some other videos on this very same quilt block, I'll put some information in the description below. But for now, let's go ahead and take that first step on our walkabout. I've been trying to find a pattern that would utilize the fabric scrap pieces that my mom gave me. This fabric is coming from my great-grandmother's scrap box. For this, you're going to need, this block finishes at 20 by 20. Each of the blocks will finish at 4 inches. So you'll need to cut your focus fabric out at 4.5 inches. So 13 blocks at 4.5 inches square. The flying geese units that are going to make up our chevrons, those are going to be made in opposing colors. So for the center rack, or for the center path, we'll have 4 flying geese made from light for the sky and dark for the peak. And then we'll make 4 flying geese with dark for the sky and light for the peak. Then for the outer rack or path, we're going to double it. So I'll need 8 flying geese with a peak of the light. So I'll cut 2 squares at 5 1/4, and then I'll cut 8 squares of the black or dark at 2 7/8, and exact opposite, 2 squares, 5 1/4, 8 squares, 2 7/8. So let's go ahead and get our flying geese prepared for that first stage. So what we want to do is we want to take, and for our first set, we're going to take our light fabrics. So this is going to be our peak fabric for these 4 flying geese. So we're going to take our sky pieces. Now you can do this a couple of different ways. So you can fold to get a center line. You can fold the piece in half and crease it, and it'll create a visual line for you to go by. You can draw. So in this case, I have this handy dandy tool here, and this is 1/2 inch wide. It has a center line going down the middle. So that's 1/4 inch from here to the edge, 1/4 inch from here to the edge. If you have a tool like this, you can essentially draw your stitch line. So you'll want to align that center line exactly corner to corner. Draw 2 lines. And I'm just using, in this case, I'm using a friction pin. So when an iron hits it, these lines will go away. When I go to sew, I will sew on the inside of the drawn line. Since my tool is exactly 1/2 inch wide, drawing these lines on the outside of that tool means that if I stitched right on those lines, I am a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch off. So by sewing on the inside of that, I will make sure that I am not cutting off the valuable real estate that I need from this fabric to make my sky pieces. So I'll just quickly do that on the same one for this one. And you can use any marking tool that works for you. There is no hard, fast, right way, wrong way, or anything like that. If folding it works best for you, by all means, fold your fabric. Okay, so now I have my drawn lines. I want to make sure that I have my right side facing up from my peak fabric, which is my large square. And I'm going to align this maybe 1 or 2 threads exposed to nudge it, to make sure that when I open up my sky pieces, that they give me a nice square, sharp edge. And I'll show you what that looks like once we've made our first stitch and cut. Then I'm going to take the second one that I drew, and I am going to place it in the same fashion, and then I'm going to pin. When I do my flying geese, I pin on both sides. And also when I go to sew my stitch lines, scant on the inside. I will feed this unit through with this top square. My needle will start up here. If I feed it through the opposite direction, where the top square is on this end, sometimes as the needle's coming through, I've discovered that sometimes I get a pucker, and that will misalign my sky pieces on my flying geese. Then for the opposing color, I'm going to take 2 of my dark squares, and here I've drawn a line down the center. Okay, so I drew the line down the center, placing it in the same fashion as I did with the other one. So if I were to turn that over and highlight that, you should see a slight white halo, maybe 1 or 2 threads width. Need to make sure that I have right side facing down, placing the second one on, and then let's go ahead and pin. And now these flying geese are ready for the first phase. Now I have already drawn lines on all of the others. So now we can prepare the outer edge. So as I said, we need 8 of each kind. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare these. Go line that up, line that up, line that up. And when I go to sew these together, I'm going to take and sew my stitch line 1/4 inch away from the center line on the left and 1/4 inch away from the center line on the right. These 2 are ready. And that's really all that this block is made of. It's flying geese and squares. Make sure I have right sides together, placing them in the same way. So we are just about done getting these prepared for the first phase of our flying geese. Pinning is an option. You don't have to pin, but I find for me, flying geese, I really do need to take that extra step and pin. So now we have our flying geese all prepared for the first stage. So again, we're just going to sew 1/4 inch on either side of the left and right side. We'll cut them down the center, and that will be the first half of our flying geese build process. With this one, since I have the 2 lines, I'm just going to stitch on the inside of this line. All right, so for our first one, if you can see, my thread is just on the inside of the drawn line. Okay, that's what we mean by a scant. Now this one, we're going to sew 1/4 inch line on either side of the drawn line. Okay, so you can see now I have 2 sewn lines, 1/4 inch on each side of the drawn line. I'm going to finish sewing the first phase for the rest of these flying geese, and I'll see you back in a stitch. Now we're ready to go ahead and give our phase 1 flying geese their first cut. All you need to do is simply cut down the center between your sewn lines. Then you should have 2 units. With these 2 units, gently roll open your sky pieces, and you should have these funny cat-like looking units. Now all of them have been cut and pressed. On to the next step. What I wanted to kind of demonstrate for you here was when we talked about the nudge factor, right? When we put our first square on, right? And we said to nudge it just so that you had 1 or 2 threads exposed from your peak fabric underneath, right? What that basically does is it helps you create a nice, sharp, right angle. And if you were to imagine this as being a rectangle, You could have, it helps to make sure that your corners are all nicely sharply aligned, so you can see that as I put my ruler, right, looks like I got a little bit afraid, but if I have my ruler aligned at the bottom and I have my ruler aligned at the top, right, then I shouldn't have any wings of fabric coming off to the side. It's just a tip or a trick to help you have more aligned flying geese. Now you should have, for each flying geese unit that we just did, you should have one more square available for it. So we're going to take that square and we're going to align it just like we did before. A little bit of nudge, all right? And that center line should be equally center in the middle of your two peak fabrics. And we're going to pin that. I'm not that good at flying geese, so I pin wherever I need to pin to make sure that they come out as good as possible. Then what we're going to do is, when we go to take this to the sewing machine the next time, same concept. We're going to sew 1/4 inch seam allowance on the left and on the right. And if our fabric and our squares are all lined up as they should be, that 1/4 inch should come right out where these two fabrics meet on both sides. And that should also be another good indicator that your fabric is pinned and placed properly. And I've pinned the majority of these already, so I'm going to finish that process. Another really good indicator is when you have your second sky piece on, you should see a nice right angle triangle. Let's take it to the sewing machine. So we're just going to take and chain stitch these. Again, sewing 1/4 inch seam allowance on the left and right side of our units. Okay, so by now you should have something that looks similar like this. A group of 4 for your outer row with the dark peak fabric and your light sky fabric. Then again, another 4 with your light peak fabric and your dark sky fabric. And then for your inner path, for the walkabout, you should have 2 units that have the light peak fabric and the dark sky fabric, and 2 with the dark peak fabric and the light sky fabric. So very similar to the first cut, we're going to take each unit and we're going to cut down the center, right? And just a gentle reminder, if you're using rotary cutters or scissors, chances are those are extremely sharp. And you want to make sure that either you have something that has a safety latch on it when you're not using it, protect it that way. All right, so that keeps little kids out of harm's way. When you're using it, go ahead and release it. Retractable rotary cutters are really nice because, again, it's only out when you're cutting and then it automatically retracts. Be conscious about the tools that you use and the harm that it could do. So let's go ahead and get to cutting. So we're just going to cut down, and I do need a new blade in here. So that's another quilting tip, if you haven't figured that one out by now, is to make sure that you have a sharp blade in your rotary cutter. All right, then once you've made that cut, you're just going to, again, like you did before, finger press, and now you have a flying geese unit. All right. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and cut all of these. And then I am going to press them all. Once we press them, we'll take the opposing flying geese. I will lay them right sides together, and also a 1/4 inch seam allowance down the edge. And then that's going to give me my chevron patch. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and square it up after that. So that's the steps. I'm going to take those steps with these, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the flying geese units for the outer row. And I'll see you back here in a little bit. So I've cut all of the flying geese units, and all I did was trim off the little dog ears. And before I piece my flying geese units together, I want to actually lay out the block to make sure that my flying geese are all in the right spots. And there is the layout. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to take each flying geese unit and I'm going to place it right sides together, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I go to sew this down, where these two red lines cross, I want to make sure that my stitch line is on the outside of that. Because what that will do is it will make sure that I do not cut off my peak here. Okay, making sure that I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Making sure that I'm very careful that my needle has not passed that X. Taking your time. This is not a race. So if you can see that stitch line, it's just on this side of the X where those two red lines intersect. And what that does is it makes sure that you keep your peak. I picked out 3 flying geese units that I thought would be good examples to demonstrate what I mean by squaring up. I think that this one here is pretty good by itself in that it's nicely centered. I have a 1/4 inch of real estate on each side so that when I go to attach it to the block, I will not lose my points. I have a 1/4 inch at the top here, so when it gets inserted into a quilt project or edges get sewed or whatever, I am good there. My point, my peak, is intact. It's not cut off. So I think this is a really good one. This should finish out to be a 4.5 by 4.5 square. So if I measure it, make sure I'm in the, you can see, I should be able to see the 4.5 inch line and the 4.5 inch line. Now if I go to cut this off, I want to make sure that if it is squared up and my peak, the center line is running through, right, and the 45-degree line is aligned with the inter sky, right? As you can see here, that's my 45-degree line. And then if I go to cut off anything that's sticking out of that, I am not taking away from the flying geese and putting my points at risk. So I would maybe slide this over just a little bit. I try to make sure that my lines are included in the fabric. Okay, instead of, if you see this white line right here, if you can see that, it is on the very, very edge. And I am actually going to just have it just a hair more. And I'm going to take off a small sliver this side, and I'm going to go ahead and try to make a pass at the top and see what comes off. All right, it's a sliver cut, but nonetheless it makes for lining it up when you go to insert it into the project with the other units. It makes it much easier. Okay, so again, I'm going to line up that 45-degree line. I turned it 180 degrees. I'm lining that 45-degree line up with that, with this edge here. And I'm going to take my 4.5-inch mark. There is an L shape, a little tick mark here. And I'm going to try to make sure that it is 4.5 inches is running parallel. 4.5-inch mark is running parallel this way. Now I'm ready to cut the other side. All right. For flying geese units, I feel like you have to balance that cut on both sides. If I were to have tried to square it up only on one side, then I feel like I would have an offset triangle. And this is a little bit offset. This is about a little bit 1/4. This might be a little bit hair over of 1/4. But it's pretty close. So I'm going to go ahead and call that one good. Now this one, this is extended a little bit on this side. Also, if you notice, this sky piece right here, it extends all the way up to there. So I need to be careful to make sure that when I go to cut that off and square it up, that I'm not taking away from my seam allowance that could potentially cause me to lose my peak. Okay, so that's this one. So let's go ahead and cut this one away. So also this ruler here has a 1/4 inch dotted line, so I can line that dotted line up with the peak of this top part right here. And then I can also, with my 45-degree line, making sure that it runs along there. And that's a nice visual indicator if you don't have a specialized ruler. So I'm going to go ahead and cut and cut. And then I'm going to turn it 180 degrees and see how it looks. All right. Let's go ahead and line that up. That looks good. And I'm actually, so take my 4.5. Okay, so 4.5 lines here, 4.5 lines here. And that looks really good. A small sliver seems to be sticking out. All right, and that one is now squared up. The last one is a little bit more distorted. And if you can see, the top piece is about 1/8 of an inch on both sides wider than the bottom piece. See, there's a gap there and there's a gap there. So I want to be very careful and very cautious when I go to square these up to make sure that I'm not cutting off my seam allowance real estate. Okay, so I'm going to use that as my landmark and this is my landmark. All right, and it looks like I got a little bit off to the side here, so I'm going to cut that. And then I'm going to cut across the top. It doesn't really look like much was cut, but what I do like about this is that this part down here, this edge, and up here, this edge, it can be a straight imaginary line. So as long as I have a nice 1/4 inch seam allowance, I am sure to have a nice straight seam line. Turn it 180 degrees. Repeat the process, line that up, 4.5, 4.5. All right. So that is squared up as best as I can get it. All right, and I have nice straight edges right there. So all I need to do is when I go to insert this into the block, I need to make sure that I am conscious of this gap right here so that I do not bypass it. And if I have a full 1/4 inch seam allowance, if I line that up and line that up, I will not cut off my tips. I'm going to continue to square up remainder flying geese, relay out the block, and we'll get to putting it together. All right, one final look to see if there's anything I want to move around. So I'm just going to start with these first 2 blocks right here. I'm going to put them right sides together. I'm going to sew my 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to take the next pair, the next pair, the next pair, and the next pair, and so on. And I'm going to do that for the first 2 columns. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do the same thing for the next pair of blocks and go all the way down. And then the last thing that I will do is I will attach the far row. So now that I have my rows pressed, they're pressed in opposing directions. So this row is going to the left, this row's to the right, left, right, left. All right. And now I'm set up for success when it comes to nesting my seams. Nesting my seams is what's going to make sure that points and seams match up. If I were to take this row here, when I go to match those seams up, right, I put them together almost as if I'm, you might consider it like a tongue and groove. And if I go to pinch them or try to slide them, they won't move. That tells me that my seams are locked in place. Then what I do is I'm going to put a pin in to hold it in place. And I'm going to do that at each point where they're at each block. When I go to sew the 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm going to stop right here, right on this particular seam. I'm going to drop the needle down. It'll hold it in place. Then I'll pull the pin out. And then I'll continue on to the next one, to the next one, and so on. I'm going to do that for each one of my rows. And I'm going to continue the process until all 5 rows are attached. All right, let's get it pressed and finish this up. All right, this concludes today's walkabout quilt block journey. I hope that you enjoyed following along. Again, thank you so much, GGM, for asking this of me. It really is a great pattern to showcase my great-grandmother's scrap fabric stash. I'm actually making a quilt out of the rest of her scrap fabric. And this is going to be more of a walkabout around the world. Each ring in the walkabout pattern is going to be different colors. And if my great-grandmother is watching over me, I hope that she's proud of what her fabrics are going to become. Thank you for joining me on today's walkabout journey. May all of your quilting journeys be joyful, one stitch at a time.